Hello and welcome to this GCSE History Revision tutorial. We're going to look at paper 3 material today, and we're going to look at the creation of Hitler's dictatorship from 1933 to 1934. We're going to cover 5 major events during this. So we'll be looking at the Reichstag Fire, the Enabling Act, the elimination of opponents, the Night of the Long Knives, and when Hitler became president. So first of all, let's have a look at the big picture. We can put our events into 3 main areas. Firstly, achieving political power over Germany, which had been achieved by March 1933. We'll have a look at the Reichstag Fire and how that led to the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler complete control and brought democracy to an end in Germany. Then we'll have a look at how the Nazis made their rule over Germany completely secure with the removal of any potential political opponents from outside the party. And then we'll have a look at how Hitler made his rule of the Nazi party completely secure with the events of the Night of the Long Knives. And then finally we'll have a look at the importance of Hitler becoming president and the oath of the army of loyalty and obedience to him. So our first key event is the Reichstag Fire. The importance of the Reichstag Fire was that this gave the Nazis the excuse for the persecution and intimidation of their political rivals. Now the fire may well have been started by a Dutch communist called Marinus van der Lubbe. He was found inside the burning building. But it's equally as likely that van der Lubbe was a stooge that had been planted there by the Nazis to take the blame for the fire, which would then allow them to exploit it, to blame the communists for the fire, and to pass laws and legislation that would help them. Now what we can definitely say is that the Reichstag building burned to the ground on the night of the 27th of February 1933. But then what followed in consequence was entirely to the Nazis' benefit. So within 24 hours 4,000 communists had been arrested, which effectively removed and disrupted a major source of rivalry for the Nazis, their main political opponents. Hitler used the fire as proof of a communist conspiracy against Germany and convinced the president, Paul von Hindenburg, to pass an emergency decree to limit civil liberties. So rights of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and freedom of printing were all suspended. It was the police that had the power to enforce this emergency decree, and the police were led by a leading Nazi, Hermann Göring. So all of this is very much in the Nazis' interests. As you might imagine, the Nazis used these extra police powers to disrupt their political opponents and used it to their advantage in the election campaign that followed. Our second key event, and this leads from the Reichstag Fire, is the Enabling Act of March 1933. The importance of the Enabling Act is that Hitler gets complete power to legislate without any consultation with the Reichstag, effectively bringing democracy in Germany to an end. Now, despite the advantages that the Reichstag Fire gave them in the election campaign, the Nazis failed to win an overall majority. This meant it would be impossible for Hitler to get the changes to Germany's constitution that he wanted. And remember, what Hitler really wants at this stage is the power to rule without the Reichstag. He was desperate to bring democracy to an end. It would only be through his complete control that he could get and enact the laws in Germany that he wanted to bring about a Nazi revolution. So, in March 1933, the Reichstag met, obviously not at the Reichstag building that had been burned to the ground. They met at the Kroll Opera House. Now the scenes inside and outside the Opera House were very intimidatory. The Reichstag delegates were intimidated outside. They were jostled, spat at and abused and threatened. The communists were banned, of course, from appearing at all. And as a result, the Reichstag delegates passed the Enabling Act by over 300 votes. Now, the consequences of this are very important. This is a key piece of legislation. It gave Hitler the right to rule as a sole dictator. He is the sole power in Germany. He no longer had to consult the Reichstag. So in effect, the Reichstag had voted its own powers away. Now we take this as the end of the Weimar Republic, bringing democracy to a close in Germany. It also paved the way for a rapid period of change. Hitler used his new powers to pass a flurry of laws to establish the Nazi state. So our third key event is the elimination of political opponents, which took place over a 4-month period. The importance of this elimination was that it made Nazi rule over Germany entirely secure. Now, the reason for the elimination of the opponents was because in the early months of Nazi Germany, there was still a chance that the Nazis' rivals, particularly the communists, could somehow force them out of power. Now, the events that follow reflect the relative levels of danger and threat that each group posed the Nazis. So, the first group that the Nazis eliminated were the communists. Over 25,000 of them were put into concentration camps. Other communists were simply rounded up and killed, or others took the opportunity, if they could, to escape and go into exile. Now, the Nazis viewed the communists as their main threat. They were their natural political enemies. So it's the communists that the Nazis targeted first. Now, once that had been largely achieved, they then focused on the democratic parties. And so the Social Democrats and their previous allies, the nationalists, were rounded up and received much of the same treatment. They were put in early concentration camps. Now, these concentration camps were along the lines of prison camps rather than the death camps later at the Holocaust. The third group that were targeted were the trade union groups. Now, these were workers' organisations that would have had the potential to disrupt the government and also to mobilise workers against them. They're also fairly socialist and left-wing in their outlook. So what the Nazis have done was to tackle the communists first, their most dangerous enemies, then influential politicians for the Social Democrats and the Nationalists, so they take the Democrats, and then lastly the trade union groups. This was highly effective. There was very little political opposition to the Nazis from inside Germany for the rest of the Nazi state. That's the next 12 years. So let's look at our fourth key event, and that's the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934. Now, this event effectively gives Hitler complete control of the Nazi Party, removing any potential opponents and rivals that he has within the Nazi structure. There were several causes for the Night of the Long Knives. We'll unpack each of them. Now, firstly, Hitler had come to a point where he needed to decide whether he would use his own paramilitary, the Nazi paramilitary, the SA, as his armed force, or whether he would use the German National Army. There were advantages and disadvantages to both. For example, the German army was a fairly small unit, limited to 100,000 men by the Treaty of Versailles, whereas the SA numbered in their millions. However, the German army were a professional force, and their leadership represented the elite, the top layers of German society. And Hitler knew that if he gave his backing to the German army rather than the SA, it would lend legitimacy to his government within Germany and internationally, and it would also attract funding. And secondly, Hitler had grown uncomfortable with how the SA had grown so big and was out of his control. Now, the SA were led by Ernst Röhm, Now you can see Ernst Röhm in the bottom right corner there. Ernst Röhm had been one of Hitler's longest serving and most loyal assistants. He'd, for example, been present during the Munich Putsch back in 1923. However, the relationship between them had suffered, and Röhm had been publicly critical of Hitler, making several drunken outbursts against him in public. He was also becoming a liability with his violent behaviour. And thirdly, Röhm was keen on taking the Nazi state into a more socialist direction than Hitler wanted. Röhm was very much interested in the benefit of rule for the working classes, whereas Hitler by this stage was more interested in leading Nazism along the nationalistic route. So there were also political differences between the two. So the events of the Night of the Long Knives were dramatic. Now Hitler used the SS to carry out a purge of the SA leadership. So the SS, who at this point are Hitler's bodyguard unit, led by Heinrich Himmler, who you can see in the middle of the photo at the bottom, over one evening arrested over 200 SA leaders, and this process continued for the next 24 to 48 hours. Now Hitler himself arrested Ernst Röhm, storming into a hotel bedroom and arrested him with a whip in his hand to kind of exert his own personal physical power over the SA leaders, really making a point with that. And over this process, over 200 of the SA leaders are imprisoned and executed, thereby effectively removing them as an independent force within the Nazi Party. So our consequences for this are twofold. This really marks the end of the SA's major influence within the party. They're not disbanded. They still have a use. They still have a purpose to play, and that's the enforcement of Nazi policy at street level. But what it also marks is the start of the growth of the importance of the SS under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler. Now this is the part of the Nazi Party that would be responsible for terror. So for example, the Holocaust, the Gestapo, are all areas of the Nazi state and Nazi actions that fall eventually under the leadership and the jurisdiction of the SS. So they start to be incredibly important to Hitler at this stage. And what's worth remembering is they were entirely loyal to him. Okay, so our final development is when Hitler became president a few months later in August of 1934, which made him the head of state and therefore gave him control of the German army. So in August 1934, von Hindenburg died. There's nothing suspicious here, he simply died of old age. But rather than there being an election, Hitler then simply declared himself as president on Hindenburg's death. Now this meant that Hitler became the head of state, and with that he became the commander of the German army. And as importantly, every soldier in the German army then swore an oath of obedience and loyalty to Hitler, even though many weren't Nazis. Now this oath would be taken very seriously. It was a matter of honour for these soldiers, and this means that Hitler has an entirely obedient and professional armed force at his disposal. So this cements his power over Germany. So let's just have a look at where we've got to. So we started our process with Hitler as Chancellor, with limited power and control. But by August of 1934, he's a dictator with complete political power and control. He's gone from a position where other parties, including importantly the communists, were campaigning actively against the Nazis, to one where there is very little political opposition, where it was illegal, and the opponents themselves were often dead or detained or had simply fled the country. Thirdly, Hitler's gone from a position of not having a majority in the Reichstag to one where he doesn't even have to consult the Reichstag to pass any laws that he wanted to pass. Fourthly, that Hitler had made his own leadership of the Nazi Party entirely secure. And lastly, he now has complete control over the German National Army, who have sworn their loyalty and complete obedience to him. Now, all of this, of course, fits together in about a year and a half at the absolute most. It might be of use at the moment if you just pause the video and just reflect on each of those red boxes and see if you can identify which of our key events delivered this development of power to Hitler. Okay, now you might want to go a little bit further with this material, just really to cement it into your memory. So if you do, here's a couple of explain questions that you might want to have a go at. If you do, you're after 3 P paragraphs: point, evidence, and then explain or elaboration. Remember, no need for any introduction or conclusion with these 12-mark questions, just 3 distinct paragraphs. So you might like to have a go at either explain why the Enabling Act was passed in 1933, and then you've got 2 pieces of stimulus material there. Or you might like to try explain why the Night of the Long Knives took place in 1934. And again, you've got 2 pieces of stimulus material to use there if you want to. Okay, we're at the end. Thanks for watching. There are other videos for you to have a look at on this EHSG History channel. You've got some Germany revision tutorials and also plenty of examination technique videos too.